Marie-Claire Forblé.
You hear me? You hear me clearly? Okay, well, I first begin by thanking the organizers for giving me this privilege of introducing very briefly the purpose of this meeting. The meeting fits within the program of the research project Vulner, and is typically a research that tries to put into an interactive dialogue disciplines that are rarely combined in the way that the Vulner project does. It is dealing really with the question, where do we stand with law and the protection under law of people that are giving the conditions, living in realities that sometimes really clash with either the mechanisms of protection or the condition to benefit from these mechanisms, and which makes these people then very often be vulnerable. And how do you bring these different types of data into one research project? It looks like a very promising research project with a consortium of several partners who really do this exercise of learning from each other and each other's fields, what law does to the people concerned and how empirical data can enrich the legal reasoning. And we had already one seminar or one webinar that was really dealing with this difficulty of bringing two ways of thinking into one research project. And that was the first webinar. This webinar is dealing with a very specific question. And if I rephrase the question today is, how do you produce what we would call valid knowledge about this highly sensitive issue that is international migration, and valid knowledge not only in terms of what are the conditions for good academic work, but specifically the validity that comes from this question that is typical in ethnography: how do I translate the complexity of the field into a knowledge that aims at reaching a broader public, to make this broader public understand what it is really about in the field. And this comes at several moments in the research. First, the researcher himself is very often a person from outside. So to collect the data, you first have to build a kind of relation of trust with the communities. And then comes the question, to what extent can you involve the communities, or do you have to involve the communities so that your voice is also their voice? And then comes the moment that you have to translate the knowledge you gain through this trust relationship into then this academic work, without losing really the benefit of having gone as deep as you can into the field. And I think that we have three people this afternoon who will do exactly that. They will tell us what it means to be a researcher, sometimes from the global north, as we call it, digging into the realities of the global south, but sometimes being yourself a researcher from the global south, as is Sophie Naguillera for us this afternoon. How do you translate it to a broader audience? You are in depth within the reality, but you nevertheless have that responsibility to come up with knowledge that the outside world will not misinterpret, but will understand thanks to your efforts. I think it's not my role really to introduce the speakers, but I can only say that I'm so happy that we have here three speakers who will, by way of testimony, really explain to us how they deal with this very difficult question. How in ethnographic work do you make sure that the knowledge you produce is valid in the deepest sense of the term, which in this case is in the full respect of the complexity of the realities in the field. I hope that with this, we have an introduction to what is ahead of us. Three wonderful testimonies. Difficult testimonies as well, probably.
Well, thank you, Marie-Claire Forblé. And now Martin Zillinger from the University of Cologne will give us some insights.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marie-Claire. Thank you, Suzanne, for putting this event together. Thank you, Luc, for not letting me off the hook when we first got into a conversation on this event today. And what I sort of prepared now after we discussed several times of what it means to generate knowledge in migration research from the position of a researcher from the global north, that what I prepared is that we have to really think about the problems of generating knowledge from these diverse positionalities we bring into the field. So let me come straight to the point. When we first discussed the challenges of ethnographic fieldwork with mobile people and migrant communities, it became quickly apparent that the enormous power asymmetries that manifest in and shape fieldwork encounters in migration research is the elephant in the room. The current debates on decolonizing knowledge, institutions and practices, and on ever perpetuating forms of racism in societies in Europe must affect work on and with migration communities. The urgency to address these issues is not only a matter of academic discourse, it manifests whenever well-paid researchers leave their safe academic environment to work with people who are often exposed to various forms of insecurity, danger, and violence. The big questions: for whom, for what purpose do researchers produce what kind of knowledge, and how, has therefore been rightly tackled in you in social research, be it at the Journal of Historical Social Research recently, in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, or numerous working papers, such as those of the Bergstresser Institute in Freiburg, and all are concerned with migration research, actually. So to be sure, acknowledging the researcher's positionality is as a well-established practice within qualitative social research. And a transnationally operating and diverse research team, such as yours at Vulna, has the means and the opportunities to indeed review the different positionalities among team members and in the field, and to engage in a mutual practice of feedback and marking, perhaps, if you will. And so I'm also excited to learn about your experiences and the measures you take to not only critically reflect upon this topic, but perhaps also to develop tools that can help translate these reflections into research methodologies and research practice. Now, traditionally, positionality in ethnographic research is in its most basic form addressed as being insider or outsider to a certain group, right? Colleagues such as Norvika and Ryan have rightly problematized this insider-outsider dichotomy, in particular for migration research. They argue that it ultimately leads to groupisms, to the presupposition that common origins or positionings produce common individuals. Instead, they argue for, quote, embracing a sense of uncertainty in encounters, unquote. And indeed, positionality such as ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, status, religion, or class, but also, as Kassan and others pointed out, physical and mental abilities and disabilities, cultural identities and social locations may well shift during the research process and in practices of relating or opposing one another in field encounters. At a closer look, it looks quite apparent that researchers constantly negotiate and manage their own identities when encountering people in the migration process. Migration processes are, as it were, complex and contradictory. Moreover, they are, in the parlance of classical anthropology, a total social fact that affects all aspects of social life, be it economic, political, legal, religious, mythological, etc. So it is not only the academic observers who see their categories of society and culture put to the test. Migrating people too are forced to repeatedly test their taken for granted categories and their own social location. They need to elaborate and define them as new as they move through space. Documented and undocumented migrants live for years in the betwixt and between of social spaces and normative orders. Their legal status, residence permit, national affiliation, etc., but also their social status, try to find a job as a migrant or be accepted as a marriage partner, is uncertain and at the same time underdetermined. They can be perceived situationally as needy, persecuted, cheap labor, students, beggars, innovation engines, terrorists, successful relatives, and so on. Now, I have to maybe say that on front, I am a big fan of Harold Garfinkel. And Harold Garfinkel was right, I think, in pointing out that a major problem of much social research stems from the academic stance to know better than the research partners what a situation, an experience, a trajectory, or in the case of migration, the overall border regime is all about. So in this tradition, methodology can become a problem when it reduces research to the empirical illustration of classification schemes and methods in the research process. From our purified academic spaces, we venture out into the world trying to impose order onto situations marked by fluidity and constant change. And this may particularly be important when we deal with migration and migration phenomena. And our methodological and ethical protocols we take with us help us to regulate the possible encounters we will have. As Garfinkel student Liberman once noted, there's nothing wrong with methodology, we even need it. And as I said in the beginning, I would hope that in places such as Bullner, we come up with new methodologies. But we have to be aware that starting to research a situation, that if we bring the methods into the field, we start to research a situation that is actually created by methodology, that is bounded by our research question of what we want to find, right? So the further you get from the world by bringing your methods into the field, the more definite the results will be, okay? So how do we deal with this problem? I think it's one of the major challenges really we have in our research. Now, the unique adequacy requirement promoted by ethnomethodology reminds field researchers to familiarize themselves first and foremost with the situational practices by which orders, regulated interactions, and their interpretations are produced, invoked, and shaped in the field, particularly among migrants and migrant communities, so that we need to understand what is actually important to the people we work with and how is order actually created and managed in practice and in situ. Embracing a position of not knowing then demands that field workers do enter learning relationships and become novices who try to trace relevancies through participant observation, through informal conversations and unstructured interviews in order to learn what is important to the people they work with. It is this situated learning via mutual assistance in the field that links the anthropological ethnographic knowledge production to the field researcher, his or her person, right? And her positioning in the field. Now, while this is all very exciting, post-colonial activists and researchers have expressed a fundamental discomfort with ethnographic fieldwork and its key method of participant observation, the forms of datafication that comes with it, and the objectification of social practices and social world it produces. Particularly ethnographers from or linked to institutions in the global north are often privileged outsiders who operate in settings characterized by enormous power asymmetries, especially when they work with communities that have suffered from colonialism, extractive knowledge production, and cultural othering. Now, I was asked to speak about the complex issues that in migration research come with being positioned as a researcher from the global north. And as I indicated in the beginning, I was not let off the hook when I hesitated to speak about my positionality as a white male researcher. And I still think that I'm the wrong person to do so. Nevertheless, of course, I'm happy to be here and to engage in this discussion today. But I would like to explain to you why I am maybe not a good person to speak about my positionality from the north, and why, on the other hand, we need discussions such as this. So I would like to start to explain you this by giving you a short ethnographic vignette from my fieldwork. So when I was visiting the Rif Mountains in northern Morocco, together with a friend in 2019, we crossed the border between Nador and Melilla, Nador in Morocco and Melilla in Spain. Routinely, we were steering towards those border officers who were sitting in small cabins to receive our passports. We handed them over and they slipped them through the digital scanner of the German Bundesdruckerei, presumably transferred to Moroccan border authorities as part of the European Security Partnership or as part of development work. Immediately, the officer saw our history of movement across the Moroccan border, and he turned to me and to my companion and asked him why he did not present his Moroccan documents. My friend, a successful journalist, born in Germany, raised in Morocco, had received German citizenship later in life and had so far passed for his work across the border without this issue of a dual citizenship being raised. This has changed through the digitalization of border control. After some discussions, the border officer took the passport and marked it as a secondary document and then made cumbersomely some remarks on his keyboards. We passed and we walked across the border, in between actually two lines, that of Moroccans on the right hand, to try to cross the border next to us, queuing up in long lines, and on the other side of that alley, that of Moroccans who just returned from Spain to the from the Spanish enclave of Melilla, going back into Nado and Morocco, queuing with huge baggages of items that would later sell on markets in Morocco. When we came back, we queued with them, waiting in the sun, rubbing shoulders uncomfortably with exhausted people, some close to fainting, all of us sweating and in constant fear of these auxiliary policemen who picked out people to search their belongings. A fight developed with the policemen violently beating, people started running, falling over each other, and we were pressed against the barrier grid. A secret police officer saw us, or more precisely, he saw me, this white European, and pulled us out of the masses of people falling over themselves. Dizzy from the sun and shaking from the sudden turmoil, we were led to the next officer, and we were embarrassed. And my friend looked at me and said, you know, if it were not for this document, the red European passport, I would be in these queues with the other Moroccans, sweating, shaking, making a living from contraband. And if it were not for your white appearance, I would still be there, pressed against the barrier. And we fell in uncomfortable silence. So most of us researching along borders can tell similar stories. There's nothing exceptional here. But only through my friend, I was marked in that very situation as a white male European who moves through a world without barriers, a world that is defined by white rules, rules that are imposed more than ever throughout the world, be it through security partnerships, so-called development work, or other forms of standardization, including our research relationships we develop and establish. And my friend, yeah.
Martin, I'm very sorry, but due to the fact that the other participant,
I'm talking too long. But I thought,
yeah, I need 15.
To. Okay, sorry? That's fine. 15 minutes, right?
Yeah,
it's okay. Let me come to a point maybe to wrap up. Okay, what I wanted to say then. Is that okay for you? So I made this sort of long introduction about positionality because this is what I thought I was asked from me. And well, basically, what I think is that in general, the problem in migration research is that that we treat the question of positionality as either one of an individual bias, sort of an individual attitude that we need to overcome, or as a result of formal structures such as border regimes that position us differently in the field. But what my suspicion is, and what I would have told you a bit longer if I would have had the time, is that actually we produce these positionalities in the field during research encounters, during interaction. And this interaction actually works with certain kinds of expectancies that recreate this kind of power asymmetries wherever we go. In a world that is structured through this sort of wide mobility regime, but also through this long history of colonization and post-colonial power asymmetries. So what So if that is true, right, and this is not a question of my personal attitude, and it is not a question of formal structures, but something that emerges whenever we interact in micro situations of our research, then we do need actually a possibility to mark the researchers from the global north who operate from this unmarked white space against which difference is constructed, to observe how actually racism and power is coming into play in these situations, even though everybody has the best intention to actually escape from that. And in order to do so, I think we need to observe it. We need to make it part of our research. And the big point I wanted to do is we need projects like yours in which we have a diverse team of researchers that can actually do the work of observing, analyzing, and bringing to light this mechanism that still actually produce these kind of racism and asymmetrical power relations in fieldwork. So I stop here.
Thank you very much, Martin. Sorry, I hate to interrupt.
Yes.
And I think, I'm sure we're going to come to many of these ideas later on in the discussion. But I actually want to disagree on one point. It's very important to have you in this conversation, and it's very important to have scholars from the global north be in such a conversation, because otherwise, you know, it's a two conversation between two sides, at least. Sophie, over to you. Okay. Sophie is a senior research fellow at the Department of Law and Anthropology at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you. Suzanne, if you're there, please share my presentation. So for this talk, I would like to talk about the challenges that I face in conducting ethnographic field research in migrant communities from a Global South context. Positionality is actually key when one is doing research. Suzanne, next slide, please. I had assumed that as a Ugandan going to do fieldwork at home, I would have easy access. However, I found that my nationality as a Ugandan was actually a hindrance to talking to refugees. People were not interested in talking to a Ugandan, but once they found out that I was coming from Germany, then I had an interest in people who wanted to talk to me. I was introduced as Sophie from Germany, and people were interested in talking to me because they thought I could get them resettlement to Europe. However, it also increased data because people, particularly refugees, once they knew that I'd grown up in Uganda and had successfully left Africa, they thought they could tell me the real reasons why they wanted to leave. This was on a project on resettlement where people would eventually tell me that the reason they wanted to leave Africa was there's no future in Africa. But personal characteristics, particularly my blackness, which I thought might help me bond with migrants, was actually an encumbrance. As a Black researcher trying to do ethnography, I tried to immerse myself in the field. But unfortunately, by trying to immerse myself, I ended up blending in with other refugees. So people could not make a distinction between Sophie, the researcher, and Sophie, the person that looks like a refugee. Whereas other people who are white were able to get access to researchers, to research participants, because whiteness is considered synonymous with saving them. In a humanitarian bureaucracy, particularly the setting pits white experts at the top of the hierarchy, while the nationals, who are predominantly Black Ugandans, are at the bottom of the hierarchy. So this white savior syndrome meant that white researchers had access to research participants, while it was difficult for me. I was always mistaken for a student and not an expert. So gender also played a role, and my being single also alienated some people. In the context of resettlement, people did not want to confess or tell their real issues to someone who was not married. Because if you're not married, how could you surely understand the real problems of life? In most African cultures, an unmarried person is still a child. So you find that all these characteristics had an impact in terms of who I could get access to and what type of data and quality of data I would get. So in order to reduce, Suzanne, next slide, in order to reduce the inherent structure of power relations that is tilted in favor of the researcher, I tried to take the stance of researcher as a supplicant. This meant that in my relationship with the migrants, I acted on based with mutual respect. I depended on the research subjects for information and guidance. I try to shift the power position to them as experts on the topics that I try to understand. For example, in terms of the resettlement project, I try to understand what the real reasons were that they wanted to leave. And in the current project on Vulner, I try to understand vulnerability from their own perspective and not through the bureaucratic framings. This significantly tries to reduce the power asymmetries and the exploitative nature of researchers from the global north. Next slide. By using aid workers and refugees as research assistants, it allows me to co-construct knowledge with them. It ensures inclusion of relevant questions that I would either miss as an outsider, but it also gives me access to the worlds that outsiders may not be privy to. For example, I'm able, through the Vulner project, to understand problems that refugees experience from their own framings of vulnerability or suffering, as opposed to bureaucratic framings used by UNHCR. So for me, when I'm in the field, I look at the role of the researcher and the researched as dialogical. This allows me insights into the worlds of aid workers and refugees and gives me insights into the nuances that shape both worlds. Next slide. But this is not without expectations. As an insider, migrants expect me to get them resettlement to Europe. They expect me to expedite bureaucratic processes, which are usually slow in the UNHCR or government offices. But they also want concrete assurances that my project will be different. You know, Uganda, being considered as one of the best places for refugees, is always teeming, at least before COVID, was always teeming with white researchers. So in this context, people feel overused, over-researched, and they didn't want me to repeat those experiences. It also comes with requests for food, medical expenses, or school fees, because these are the real issues that migrants are suffering from, and they expect me to play the role of advocate to the EU, and in particular Germany, where they think I can make a difference. But it's not just migrants. Please, next slide. It's not just migrants that have expectations. As an indigenous insider or a native researcher, aid workers expect me to write favorably about their organizations, even when they have given me inside information about the complexities of implementing aid. They also expect me not to disclose relevant information. So sometimes they talk to me not as a researcher, but as a friend. And they also expect me not to ask sensitive issues. For example, Uganda is known to be homophobic, and I use that in quotation marks. So they were surprised when I would bring up LGBTQ questions in terms of how they are protected. They expected me not to ask those questions or to simply move on if they didn't respond. They also sometimes request for lifts to the settlement or within the settlement because sometimes resources are scarce. This allows me to get the inner workings of the settlement as they express their frustrations in terms of the shortfalls they encounter when doing this work. But I found that this was also reciprocal. Many times my car broke down on the way to the settlement, and they would also reciprocate by giving me a ride. I was not just an outsider to them, I was an insider, even to aid agencies that I didn't know very well. Now, as an insider, you get in contact with ethical dilemmas. Next slide, Suzanne. The price of being an insider comes at a high cost. Once people have built rapport with you or you have built rapport with them, you become a witness to indiscretions of key informants and gatekeepers, particularly in the Ugandan context. People expected having, that I understood as a Ugandan the challenges of working in such a settlement. So sometimes they would engage in legal activities while I'm watching. And for the refugees, as an insider in their world, they expected that I could help them take evidence of these illegalities to Geneva, for example. They would tell me, well, I have this dossier, it's an envelope. If you can please send it to the High Commissioner in Geneva, you will be helping us. This raises very important questions for how to protect migrants who want to be whistleblowers, but also yourself. You know, what role do you want to play in the field? Most of the literature out there focuses on harms of the do no harm principle to informants, but it does not say much about protecting the researcher who's working at home in a potentially dangerous context. The next slide talks about the importance of being reflexive. In the Varna project itself, I have found that it could potentially cause harm. You know, for example, when I'm in the field and people mistake me as someone that Europe has sent to get them resettled to Europe, when I'm asking them to sign consent forms, they want to always tick the box where they give their identity, because they think that how else will I trace them back when they're getting resettled, even when I explain several times that I'm not here to resettle you. So you sense that the consent is given contingent on an expectation of resettlement. Also, sometimes it's uncomfortable when you feel like you're a voyeur into the lives of very vulnerable migrants. You're there to get into their world and understand it in depth, but then you can't really change their lives. And this was particularly uncomfortable in the pre-COVID days, where the settlements were swarmed with white researchers everywhere. In fact, there were actual guides in the settlements where they would take you to look at people who were extremely vulnerable or not. During the pandemic, when I started the project, I felt that the project was doing harm because people were working from home, meaning that the human capacity of aid agencies was very much limited, but then I was taking valuable time away from them that could be used to attend to refugees, and the time was shifted to me in answering questions that sometimes took hours. I also found out in this latest trip to Uganda that some brokers were charging money to refugees in order to talk to me, you know. And once I found that out, I realized that even when you don't know and you try to minimize the exploitation of migrants, your very role of being in the field can be actually exploited by others. So the next slide talks about how I've tried to deal with dilemmas. I've tried to balance the role of insider, outsider by trying to avoid getting too close. Of course, this is not always successful. Sometimes I get migrants who want to use their own interpreters, and I'm supposed to respect that. But then these interpreters sometimes always may be brokers, and so they do not translate everything that the migrant is asking. And how I know that is that there are some words that are intelligible. The person could be talking about rape, and this person is trying to translate something to do with LGBTQ, because they know that if you're LGBTQ, you may get resettled quickly. Yeah. So I try to remind myself and also migrants by managing the expectations that I'm just a researcher. And in doing that, I try to tell them what I can do and I can't do. And however, I try to also balance this role of researcher and activist by trying to give back to the community. By giving back, I don't want to just extract knowledge from them. And as an activist, what I've done, I try to mobilize my family and friends to donate whatever they can, and then I redistribute it in the settlements. I've also tried to decommodify access to the researcher, to myself, by ensuring that I repeatedly tell people that it is free to talk to me, and I devalue the process by ensuring that I give business cards to anyone and tell them they can reach me anytime that they want. The next slide talks about kind lies and harsh truths. My research assistants have told me that sometimes I'm too much of a lawyer. By telling people the truth that I can't resettle them, I'm told that I'm killing their hope. One particular refugee who is my research assistant said, sometimes you have to lie. These people have been through so much. You can't just kill their hope by telling them you have no power to resettle them. Sometimes I'm accused of being too white, and that means being too pedantic by insisting on signing of consent forms or asking for consent before taking pictures. They think it's very un-Ugandan to do that. So that also shows you how people have been abused in these settings, where people just take their pictures without even asking them and use them for their own purposes. Sometimes they compliment me by saying that I'm not Ugandan, because in this particular setting, Ugandanness is associated with being a crook. So they tell me if I hadn't had you speak Luganda, I would not have believed you're Ugandan. And when I ask them why, they say, you're very honest. That's not Ugandan-like. Or sometimes they tell me, you're too good. You have a good heart. How can you be Ugandan and have a good heart? But that is also indicative of how they perceive the aid workers who cater to them. So in conclusion, next slide. In conclusion, even though I am aware of the power asymmetries and I know that I try to reduce them, it is not that because you're aware of them that these are automatically reduced. In certain cases, I find that aid agencies have more power than I do because they're the main gatekeepers, but also not all migrants are that vulnerable. In the context of Uganda, we have refugee leaders. So if you want to access certain groups, you have to go through those leaders. So those leaders have more power than the researcher because they open up gates to people you can talk to and who you can talk to. However, it is important to continue negotiating and renegotiating your role in the field to ensure that you do not tip the power asymmetries in your favor to the detriment of the migrant. I also try to do this by navigating ethical dilemmas in creative ways. I don't purport to say that I'm always successful, but I always endeavor in trying. And in analyzing and presenting the data, I try to give context to explain what drives migrants' behavior. I don't just say that this is illegal or illegal, moral or immoral. I try to understand in that context what structures and systems are shaping and sustaining certain actions. So this, for me, requires constant reflexivity and revisiting the do no harm principle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for finishing 30 seconds ahead of time. Thank you. It's always very fascinating to get and hear the voices on the ground and what's happening and what does it mean to be a local versus non-local, if we can even use this terminology. Over to Nina.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Oh, sorry. All right, so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today and the invitation. I'm very happy to contribute to this seminar, which deals with important, though not easily solvable issues. So I was invited to talk about how we move past Western-centric approaches to research. And I think it's important to emphasize, that's already been mentioned, that moving past Western centrism in research demands much more fundamental engagement than what could be encompassed by a methodological or analytical design in a research project. So, without claiming to have solved the challenge, what I will do today is present a mode of analysis that I've developed along with my colleagues, Marie Senberg and Luca Rossi, which we call Contrapuntal analysis, taking a cue from music and from the work of Tim Ingold and Edward Said. So we developed this mode of analysis in order to approach disparate research materials, yet our ethical and epistemological reasons for doing so, or for both methodological and analytical designs, connect well with the challenge of moving past Western centrism. So let me start out by briefly introducing the DigiNauts project and its methodological design. With a focus on irregularized migration, DigiNauts investigated how migrants' widespread, varied, and innovative digital practices remake migration and potentially create networks of solidarity as migrants navigate through the European border regime. The methodological design had two components: ethnographic fieldwork with former irregularized migrants and solidarians in 3 field sites that were part of the route which many irregularized migrants traveled through in Europe in 2015 during the search and migration that year, namely Greece, Germany, and the Danish-Swedish borderland, and social media data generated through API access to a curated list of public Facebook pages connected to these ethnographic sites. This talk is concerned with the ethnographic research in the Danish-Swedish borderland, and with a smaller corresponding subset of our big data. So this methodological design left us with a large set of big data, which we term big social data, and interview transcripts and field notes that we term ethnographic material, insisting that this is not a form of data. Before I introduce our epistemological framework, I would like to talk briefly about a challenge we faced of moving past inbuilt platform logics, which reflect the interests of multi-billion-dollar Western companies. That is, our big social data invited for an analysis which centered on activity, posts, likes, shares, comments, rather than on relations or content. Thus, we spent some time looking into spikes in our data with the hypothesis that these spikes were connected to important events. However, looking into this particular spike, for instance, we found that rather than relating to, say, news about a border, a political decision impacting routes or similar, it was mainly produced by a very cheerful video of Syrians teaching Germans how to dance the Syrian folk dance Dabke. While this might seem a banal insight now, the predisposed logics of data sets, whether instigated by research teams' positioning, platform logics, or something else, is important to be aware of. So it was clear to us that our big social data and our ethnographic material were created differently, had different implicit rationalities, and spoke different languages. However, we still saw them as fundamentally interconnected, as produced through an engagement with the same world. And we wanted our mode of analysis to acknowledge this. Also, we wanted to move beyond modes of analysis in which data and materials are ordered along predefined scales of big or small, thick or thin, and where different materials are used to confirm, complement, or create context for one another. We found inspiration in the concept of counterpoint in music, which allowed us to establish relations in our data as, and material as contrapuntal rather than summative. Tim Ingold challenges the idea of life as a whole, as a sum of its parts, and proposes the idea of correspondence, which entails that parts are not components that are added to one another, but movements that carry on alongside one another. He elaborates. So too, in the human family, lives lived in counterpoint are not and, but with. And in answering or responding to one another, they co-respond. He contends that life itself then is not the summation, but the correspondence of its particulars. The idea of contrapuntality was introduced by Edward Said. It is especially pertinent for us to return to Said, since the state of exile, which is at the heart of our endeavor, was crucial to his life and scholarship. Said's idea of contrapuntality is based on the same premise of connectedness as that of Ingold. Relations between colonizer and colonized, former colonizer and formerly colonized, take center stage in Said's reflections. Said contends, Said contends that we must be able to think through and interpret together experiences that are discrepant, each with its particular agenda and pace of development, its own internal formations, its internal coherence and system of external relationships, all of them coexisting and interacting with others. With the musical metaphor, various themes play off one another, with only a provisional privilege being given to any particular one. Yet, in the resulting polyphony, there is concert and order, an organized interplay that derives from the themes, not from a rigorous melodic or formal principle outside the work. While Ingold, working from the perspective of anthropology, speaks of lives and souls, Said, grounded in the tradition of literary criticism, speaks of voices and texts. We find it useful that their two foci explicitly address our two types of material, namely the lived lives that take center stage in our ethnography and the text that we choose to foreground in our big social data. That is, while we maintain that our materials are inherently interconnected, corresponding with the same world, we remain aware of their diverse ontological heritages and the frictions these produce. The different modes of data production have facilitated different paths to knowledge. One foregrounds life as experienced, the other foregrounds textual traces. Our point is not to seek out particular connections, but instead to acknowledge interconnectedness. So we approach our data and material as answerable to one another. Let me explain a bit more in detail how we performed the analysis before moving on to a brief illustrative example. We first searched our subset of big social data for the term border, as this was key to our overall research focus. We ended up with a list of less than 200 posts in 5 different languages. Concurrently, we filtered the ethnographic material, which we'd coded with the term border. Reading through these posts and ethnographic materials together, 3 different modes of the border emerged. We term these political legal border, solidary border, and border navigated. Unsurprisingly, these 3 versions of the border did not emerge equally from the 2 sets of material and from the different subgroups of our material. For instance, our Arabic language big social data particularly spoke to border navigated and political legal border, while English and local languages in the respective countries particularly spoke to solidary border and political legal border. Our ethnographic material from conversations with solidarians spoke to all 3 border versions, while our ethnographic material from conversations with refugees rarely spoke to the solidarian border. I'll only be able to provide a brief hint at an example of our analysis of these border versions that remains illustrative in kind. Regulation of EU external and internal borders is not stable, sometimes enforced as spot checks, at others depending on individual border guards' practices, and at others enforced by built or natural hostile environments or weather. This instability of the border emerges concurrently through our different materials. For irregularized migrants, the border environment could change very quickly, for instance, due to weather conditions, border closings ahead, or border police approaching at certain times. The border instability requires attentiveness to the here and now of the border, characteristic of the border navigated. This emerges from our social media data through posts such as of tomorrow, Tuesday, Hungary will tighten border crossing procedures and punish illegal crossings with imprisonment. They have sent more than 900 additional police officers to protect the border and close it completely. And through efforts to obtain information such as, who has more information about the Danish border today? There's often a future orientation to these updates which aim to facilitate or inform navigation. The border crossing practices comprise navigation both through and around the built border. Turning to our ethnographic material, the affinity between traced lives and experienced lives in navigating the instability of the border becomes visible. After arriving in Northern Europe in September 2015, Reda and Siad took a regular bus, trying to blend in among regularized travelers. As they reached the border, a police officer entered the bus and asked everyone to take out their passports. Reda silently told her husband to remain quiet as the police officer approached them. She then explained to her that they were from Lebanon, but living in Germany, and that they were on their way to visit her uncle who lived in the country they were trying to enter, a story which only bore a vague connection to the truth. The police officer asked if they had their passports with them. Reda confirmed, hinting at her bag. Without asking them to show their passports, the police officer let them stay on the bus. Reda and Siad saw other irregularized migrants being led off other buses at the border, but they were themselves allowed to cross the border despite never showing their non-existent Lebanese passports. While each subgroup of a research material tells stories about the border independently from others, our analysis emerges from both the big social data and the ethnographic material. Approaching our material contrapuntally allows us to capture the ways in which different border versions emerge across the different subgroups of materials. I realize that this is a very superficial glimpse into our analysis, but for anyone interested in learning more, we have a book chapter coming out soon in this edited volume from the Diginauts project, and please do email me for preprint versions. And as I said earlier, I don't believe this approach by any means relieves us of the challenges of Western centrism. We've made many decisions along the way, which were informed by our positionality and the limitations that this involves. However, it is worth thinking about how different modes of combining ethnographic research with computational data production and more can open up for new insightful modes of analysis while remaining aware of the pitfalls of both researcher positionality and logics embedded in data sets. And I'm looking very much forward to learning more about what the insights that comes out of the Volner project in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. A lot to digest and a lot to discuss, and I've just posted a note to all attendees inviting them to send their questions through the Q&A function, and so far we don't have any questions. Okay, we have the first question. from Elena Horton. How can, for all participants, how can participatory approaches work with the challenges presented? I'm not sure who would like to respond to this. Sophie, would you like to take this question since you've worked a lot with participants on the ground? Yeah, Sophie.
How can participatory approaches work with challenges presented?
The sound is a little bit low, Sophie, if you can. Right now, please.
Hold on. I find the question a bit vague. What does she mean by participatory approaches? Does she mean participant observation? Well,
it depends. It could be different forms of either participatory action research, or it could be participatory observation, but also co-analysis, so engaging with the participants at different stages of the research.
Well,
I think participant action research, I think she just said.
I don't know what she means by participant action research, but for me, participant observation has allowed me to understand the challenges in real time that aid workers, for example, experience in implementing certain programs. Usually when I conduct interviews with migrants, when they don't get what they want, they tell you their understanding of the problem. Basically, they'll tell you we were discriminated against, but sometimes when you observe how the aid workers are actually implementing the programs or the challenges they face, you realize that they're not telling refugees everything. You know, there's a lack of transparency in communicating these problems. So I think when you're on the ground, you're able to understand the nuances. But in terms of overseeing the challenges, I think that is context specific. In my case, I didn't see any challenges. The challenges only arose where I was witnessing illegal activities, for example. How do I document this? Do I want to document this when I'm being observed? I don't know if I'm answering the question. Maha, I can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Yes. Nina, yes, please go ahead if you'd like to make a contribution to this question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add that I do think participatory action research can be a very important tool, but I don't think that it necessarily relieves us or sort of relieves us of these problems. I think it might help highlight some of them. And one experience I can talk about from my own work is writing an article with a research participant. And what that really brought out was we were really struggling with finding a sort of common voice in this article. And parts of that issue also dealt with the sort of inherent hierarchies that are placed on researcher and research participant.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. Since we don't have any more, oh no, we have in the Q&A, yes, more. I was trying to be cheeky and to ask a question myself, but maybe later on. Okay, so a question to Martin, asking you to expand your concluding reflections. I have a feeling the argument hide there somehow.
Thank you. That's kind. I mean, so what I'm actually taking a lead from the work that has recently been published by Ann Rawls and Melberly Duck on tacit racism in the United States. And they make, I think, the compelling argument that we need to understand how racism is actually emerging within interaction settings by expectancies people bring into situations of interactions that then actually sort of frame how people relate to each other across color divides in the US, for example. But I think that this actually also is something that we should elaborate further on in migration research and ethnographic research in general, because I think it is not about being better trained. We are all quite well trained in the meantime, I think, about positionality, for example. It is not so much about psychologizing attitudes, and it's not only about formal structures and things like border regimes, but it is really about how we actually maneuver through the world and into situations of cooperation that actually bring about, or that actually cannot get rid of these kind of power asymmetries that we always face. Now, what we really need is to zoom in onto that. And this is very painful, because once I have been engaging with colleagues on this position differently in the research environment, I just have to face where, well, sort of tacit racism is playing out. And this to have this documented and to analyze this means to sort of triangularize this kind of relationship that emerges in the field and really, well, first of all, bring it to the light. And it's not easy to do that. And I think actually that in projects like such as Vulna, where you have researchers from different backgrounds and diverse sort of positionalities, it is a unique possibility to do that, and then actually hope that we can bring this out into other domains. So this is a kind of knowledge I would really like to see to be produced. Yeah.
May I hear, it's a question for all of you, and I'm sorry just to prompt, but I feel we're talking a lot in this discussion here. We're talking very much as individuals, our positionality as individuals. And I feel more and more our identity politics is becoming the key issue. And I feel like, is that the issue? Because this is, I don't know to what extent, and if we ever can get out of it, or is it a more structural issues? More structural issues about who produces knowledge, who writes about migration, who goes there, and who has the funding, the positions, and to what extent, like the power dynamics within the structure, play a factor. And is it there where some of the, issues need to be addressed? So for instance, as a researcher in the global South, I'm not allowed to apply for many grants. I don't meet the eligibility criteria, and I need the scholar from the global North. To the publication, to the language that we shared in this presentation, etc., that sometimes it limits researchers from different, like in terms of who's producing knowledge. So it's just a question about positionality. I mean, do we want to go to the individual, and where is the situation or the position of the institution and the structure? Anyone is free to answer this question very quickly, and I know there are many questions else, and we can also skip that if you wish.
Well, I think this is extremely important, and so my plea is actually also not to look into the individual and what the individual is doing, but into interaction orders, and interaction orders that are actually at place across borders and sort of globally standardized in a way, and to zoom, and in order to understand them better, to actually look into the very practices of interaction and try to do research on that. On plus then comes actually these structural forms of inequalities that you mentioned, and that we really have to work hard on changing, but I'm not sure how to do it. I mean, All Peace, perhaps, the platform of collaborative experimental ethnography. I think it's a wonderful sort of way to actually try to produce data together with your research partners, but you still have, of course, this kind of structural inequalities of access, of language, of technology, and so forth.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the questions. Okay, so we have a question to what extent do your conclusions and suggestions for research practice extend to doing research with migrants in the EU? Where do you see important differences? Anyone would like to answer this question?
Well, I can just say that my research has actually been about migrants in the EU, so I think that's a sort of obvious match.
Okay, I'm going to move to a question. Okay, 1 minute. how much do you think the choice of the subject of the research is important? Why do you as individuals choose to research on your topics? That's a key question. Yes, Sophie?
I think in the context of doing research in the Global South, the topic you choose to study is very critical and important because it even determines whether migrants are even interested in talking to you at all or not. For me, for the project on resettlement, I was very much interested in choosing that particular topic because I had gone to understand land conflicts in this particular settlement and nobody had anything to say about this issue. And when I inquired later, I realized everybody was talking about resettlement. And it actually made sense. If people want to leave the country, there's nothing to fight about in terms of land conflict. You know, I was trying to look at the effects of Uganda's land policies because every refugee that comes to Uganda is given a piece of land. So I wanted to understand whether that caused any conflicts. So in essence, my research question evolved to resettlement because that was what was driving and still is driving migrants to bureaucratic offices in the camp. So I don't know if that partially answers her question.
Thank you. I'm aware of time. We have 1 minute left. We agreed to extend for 5 minutes. So I'm gonna, Nina, nice. Thanks for the nice presentation. I'm wondering if and how issues of positionalities does arise from researchers working with big data, particularly those mined from social media.
Yes, and thank you so much for this question. I think it's very, very important. And in the Digital Arts project, I think one of the ways that it becomes obvious is that we certainly, while there was certainly a sort of important reason to focus on Arabic as a sort of refugee language in this context, we also had a research team in which Arabic was the only refugee language represented, which meant that, for instance, Afghan refugees were sort of not really very present in our big data sets and in our ethnography, of course, but that was sort of a given due to our positionality in terms of, or as ethnographers, but it also filtered into our data set because we didn't have the same kind of access to those Facebook pages that dealt with other languages or were in other languages. So I think it's very, very important.
Thank you. I'm aware of time, and there's so much. I feel like it's such a shame that we had a short time for discussion. I think next time we ought to allow for more time because there's so many ideas that have been discussed. I mean, Sophia, I wanted to pick up on your ideas of research ethics, and I think as researchers in the global South, we often feel that the research ethics that we have to sign up to are to protect institutions in the global North, not to really protect us or the participants in the global South. And I think there's a serious discussion that one needs to pick up on research ethics and how, and research ethics is not only about the process, it's also about the collaboration and the partnership as well. You want to say something quickly on this?
Yes, yeah. That is very, very true. And also to add to it, it's in certain contexts very irrational. For example, to many of the consent forms that I have, the information makes no sense in the context that I'm working in. When you say that you will report illegal activity, when the actual camp is run and by the main order of illegalities, you know, it's almost as if you're begging people not to talk to you because that's how the camp is run. And you're telling them, I will report illegal activities, you know? So I find that it's usually about protecting the global North without actually understanding the context in which we do certain work, and that what is illegal is actually blurred in this context. If it is the normal way of doing things, can we really say it's illegal? Illegal according to who? According to the global North? So that is something that I struggle with in this.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. I'm just going to conclude by thanking all the attendees for staying on longer, for all the panelists for their amazing presentations. There are many things I want to read after your presentations now. And I think I want to also thank the organizers for a number of things. One is And it was difficult to negotiate why in this project we had participants from the global north and south. And we often had to justify this conversation. And I think it's important for us as scholars in different positionalities we have to push for that kind of dialogue. And the other thing that I also appreciate about this conversation is the diversity, because often what I'm noticing is that we're either collapsing into global south or north. So we either have talks between global south scholars alone on their own or global north scholars. And I think this is why I think, Martin, it's important to, this is why I think it's important to be in this conversation for all of us. Otherwise, it will be, you know, a very, mono conversation. Thank you, everyone, and sorry for the questions we weren't able to answer. So, Susan, over to you if you want to have to say, if you want to say anything at the end.
No, I just want to thank everybody again very much for your fruitful discussion, and I think every one of us would have loved to take more time, so I'm really happy that you agreed to stay a few minutes longer. And well, thanks again from my side as well for having this really interesting, giving us all these interesting insights from your work and from your thoughts.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.